Number: The Sound of Justice. Grace Marshall, a compassionate African-American maid at the Thompson estate, carefully extracts a strange organic growth from the ear canal of 8-year-old Ethan Thompson, the son of powerful business magnate Caleb Thompson. The boy, deaf since birth, suddenly gasps, covering his ears against the household sounds. Caleb enters, witnessing his son hearing for the first time, but instead of gratitude, his face darkens with suspicion and rage, setting in motion a battle that will challenge everything Grace has worked for, threatening not only her livelihood but her freedom, in a society that rarely sides with those who look like her. Grace Marshall had learned to be invisible. At 32 years old, she had mastered the art of moving efficiently through the enormous Thompson mansion on the outskirts of Boston, dusting crystal vases worth more than her yearly salary without leaving a fingerprint, anticipating needs before they were voiced, and most importantly, keeping her eyes down when Caleb Thompson entered a room. The Thompson estate sprawled across 12 acres of manicured lawns and gardens, a modern fortress of glass and stone that showcased the telecommunications fortune of its owner. Grace had worked there for 3 years, grateful for the position that paid better than most, even if it came with the unspoken requirement that she endure constant microaggressions and thinly veiled insults. She had been hired primarily to help care for Ethan, the youngest Thompson child, born deaf and largely ignored by his father, who viewed his condition as an embarrassment and inconvenience. Despite her official title as a maid, Grace often found herself serving as Ethan's caretaker, teacher, and only real friend in the coldly efficient household. She had studied special education in college before financial hardship forced her to drop out, knowledge that made her uniquely qualified to communicate with the bright, observant boy using sign language she taught herself through online courses. Caleb Thompson rarely acknowledged her special attention to his son, though his wife Olivia occasionally expressed quiet gratitude when her husband was away on business. Today was one of those rare, peaceful days when the mansion belonged to just Grace, Olivia, and Ethan. The staff had been reduced since Caleb was on a 2-week business trip to Singapore, leaving Grace with more responsibilities but also more freedom. She was cleaning Ethan's bathroom when she heard a thud from his bedroom. She found him on the floor beside his bed, pressing his hands against his ears with an expression of pain. Grace quickly knelt beside him, checking for injuries before signing to ask what was wrong. The boy pointed frantically to his right ear, his face contorted. Concerned, Grace helped him onto the bed and used the small penlight she kept in her uniform pocket to examine his ear. What she saw made her breath catch a pale, fleshy growth unlike anything she had encountered before, filling a significant portion of his ear canal. She had cleaned his ears before as part of her duties, but this seemed to have appeared or grown substantially in just the past few days. Medically untrained but intuitively concerned, Grace spent her lunch break researching on her phone, discovering several rare fungal infections that could cause similar growths. She documented what she had seen with careful notes, but hesitated to report her findings. Previous attempts to make suggestions regarding Ethan's care had been met with derision and warnings to stay in her place. The Thompsons had spent small fortunes on specialists who pronounced Ethan's deafness congenital and irreversible, more interested in billing for expensive treatments than investigating further. That evening, while preparing Ethan for bed, Grace noticed him scratching aggressively at his ear again. Making a decision that would change both their lives, she examined him once more, noting the growth seemed larger and appeared to be causing him significant discomfort. She carefully documented the changes with her phone camera, creating evidence of what she was seeing. While putting away laundry the next morning, Grace discovered something that turned her concern to alarm a folder of dismissal notices for 3 previous household employees who had worked with Ethan, all containing references to overstepping their positions by suggesting medical interventions. Each had been African American or Hispanic, while white employees with similar tenures had received promotions or glowing recommendations upon leaving. The pattern was unmistakable discrimination intertwined with medical negligence, revealing a system designed to silence those who questioned authority, particularly when they looked like her. The morning light filtered through the expensive custom blinds of the Thompson mansion, casting long shadows across the marble flooring as Grace organized her cleaning supplies. Her discovery of the personnel files had left her with a heavy decision weighing on her conscience. Before she could determine her next steps, Olivia Thompson appeared in the doorway of the utility room, her slender frame tense with an unusual urgency. Olivia, typically composed and distant in the carefully cultivated manner of wealthy socialites, looked uncharacteristically disheveled, her designer clothing wrinkled as though she had slept in it. "Have you got a minute, Grace?" she asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Surprised by the direct approach, Grace nodded and followed Olivia to the seldom-used sunroom at the back of the house, far from the ears of other staff. Once the doors were closed, Olivia collapsed into a chair, tears welling in her eyes. "I need your help," she whispered. "I know you care about Ethan more than anyone else in this house, including his father." Grace remained standing, maintaining the professional distance expected of her position, while Olivia revealed the troubling dynamics of her marriage. Caleb Thompson, she explained, had grown increasingly controlling over the years, his success in business breeding a conviction that his judgment was infallible in all matters. His prejudices, once carefully hidden behind closed doors, had become more overt as his wealth and influence expanded. The tipping point had come 3 months ago when Olivia had secretly taken Ethan to a specialist in New York, who had suggested exploratory procedures that might identify previously undetected issues. When Caleb discovered the appointment, he had been furious, accusing Olivia of undermining him and wasting money on quackery. He had confiscated her credit cards and limited her access to their accounts, establishing himself as the sole decision-maker regarding Ethan's medical care. "I'm filing for divorce," Olivia confessed, her voice barely audible. "The papers will be served when he returns from Singapore. I wanted to wait until after his trip to avoid his immediate retaliation." Olivia leaned forward, her expression intense. "Caleb prefers Ethan's condition. It gives him control, lets him present himself as the devoted father of a special needs child while actually keeping Ethan dependent and isolated." Grace remained cautiously silent, years of self-preservation warring with her concern for the boy. Sensing her hesitation, Olivia pulled out a folded document from her pocket. "This is a signed authorization giving you permission to seek medical attention for Ethan in my absence. I've also added you as an authorized guardian at his doctor's office. I trust you, Grace. I've seen how you are with him." The request represented a seismic shift in household dynamics, a crossing of boundaries that could cost Grace her position or worse. But the image of Ethan's pained expression as he clutched at his ear made the decision inevitable. "I noticed something in Ethan's ear yesterday," she admitted quietly, describing the unusual growth and showing Olivia the photos she had taken. By that afternoon, Grace had transformed the guest house at the far end of the property into an impromptu medical research station, using the high-speed internet connection and her own laptop to investigate potential causes, while Olivia kept the other staff occupied with preparations for an upcoming charity event. Grace's suspicions were confirmed through careful documentation and comparison with medical literature she was able to access. The growth appeared to be a rare fungal infection that could indeed block auditory pathways if left untreated. With Olivia's written authorization, Grace scheduled an appointment with an otolaryngologist for the following day, only to discover it would be impossible to keep. The household erupted into chaos that evening when Caleb Thompson unexpectedly returned home, his business trip cut short by manufacturing problems in Malaysia. He found Grace reviewing medical websites on her laptop in the kitchen during her break, Ethan's file open beside her. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice dangerously quiet as he towered over her. Before Grace could respond, he snatched up the medical notes she had compiled. "You're going through my son's private medical information." His voice rose with each word. "Stealing proprietary family documents. Who do you think you are?" Grace stood her ground, explaining Olivia's authorization and her concerns about Ethan's condition. Caleb's face contorted with fury, color rising from his collar to his forehead. "My wife has no authority to override my decisions," he hissed, tearing up the authorization form Grace produced. "You're a maid. Your job is to clean toilets, not play doctor." The tirade continued for several minutes, culminating in a threat that made Grace's blood run cold. You're suspended without pay pending review for violating confidentiality agreements. If I find you've shared any of this information or contact my son again, I'll make sure you never work in this state again. I know judges, police chiefs, and every hospital administrator in the region. Remember that before you try anything else." He stormed out, leaving Grace shaken but resolute, knowing she had crossed a line from which there was no return, and that Ethan's well-being now depended on her willingness to risk everything. Relegated to night shifts and restricted to cleaning the main floor of the mansion, Grace found herself effectively banished from contact with Ethan. Caleb had made it clear that her continued employment hung by the thinnest of threads, preserved only by Olivia's insistence and the difficulty of finding replacement staff on short notice before their annual summer gala. The mansion operated in a state of frigid tension, with Caleb working from home to monitor the household while accelerating plans to send Ethan to a prestigious boarding school for the deaf in Vermont, conveniently removing him from any potential influence Grace might have. Despite the restrictions, Grace refused to abandon her concerns about Ethan's condition. During her off hours, she transformed her small apartment bedroom into a research hub, walls covered with printouts and notes. The fungal growth she had observed matched descriptions of Aspergillus tubangensis, an unusual species that thrived in warm, moist environments and could form dense colonies if unchecked. Most significantly, this particular fungus produced compounds that deteriorated when exposed to certain enzymes found in pine oil, offering a gentle extraction method that posed minimal risk. Grace developed a solution using ingredients available without prescription, testing its effectiveness and safety through careful research. Her determination was fueled not only by concern for Ethan, but by memories of her younger brother Malcolm, whose early signs of sickle cell anemia had been dismissed by emergency room doctors as exaggeration until a crisis nearly claimed his life. The medical system's tendency to minimize the concerns of Black patients and their families had cost her brother months of preventative care, a pattern she recognized repeating in Ethan's case. Gaining access to Ethan proved challenging but not impossible. The 8-year-old had developed a system of communication through drawings left in specific locations throughout the house, places only Grace would think to check. His artwork revealed not only his intelligence, but his awareness of the household tensions. One particularly detailed drawing showed a large figure with a thundercloud for a head standing between smaller figures, one with curly hair like Grace's. The message was clear. Ethan understood the conflict centered around him. An unexpected ally emerged in Harold Jenkins, the Thompsons' 70-year-old groundskeeper who had maintained the property for over 30 years. Harold, one of the few African-American senior staff members, had witnessed decades of the Thompson family's behavior and recognized the familiar patterns unfolding around Grace. They had never spoken at length before Caleb's return. But Harold began finding reasons to be near the house during Grace's shifts, offering quiet words of support, and serving as an occasional messenger between Grace and Olivia, who had become increasingly isolated as Caleb asserted control over the household. The old man's weather-beaten face held decades of stories, similar to Grace's current struggle, his quiet dignity masking experiences with discrimination that made Grace's situation painfully familiar. "You remind me of my daughter," he told her one evening, as they briefly crossed paths in the garden. "She's a pediatrician now, fought twice as hard to get half as far, but she made it. Don't let them convince you that you don't know what you're seeing." Through Harold, Grace learned that Ethan's discomfort had worsened, with the boy now refusing to let anyone touch his ears and showing signs of pain and dizziness that even Caleb could not ignore. Rather than reconsidering Grace's observations, however, Caleb had scheduled a consultation with Dr. Alexander Reynolds, a celebrity otolaryngologist known for his experimental surgical techniques and regular appearances on medical reality shows. Harold overheard enough of a phone conversation to report that Reynolds was flying in specifically to evaluate Ethan for an innovative surgical procedure that would potentially implant a new type of hearing device directly into his auditory nerve pathways. The surgery was scheduled for just 3 days later, an unusually rushed timeline that suggested the decision had more to do with Caleb's ego and connections than medical necessity. That evening, While polishing the grand staircase banisters, Grace overheard Caleb in his study, his voice carrying through the partially open door. "This procedure will completely transform Ethan's situation," he was saying, presumably on a phone call. "Reynolds says it's cutting edge, not even available to the general public yet. We'll be the first family in New England to access this technology. The clinical trial results aren't even published, but he's making an exception for us." The conversation confirmed Grace's worst fears. Caleb's interest lay in the prestige of pioneering an experimental procedure, rather than finding the safest solution for his son. Later that night, as she was leaving through the service entrance, Grace felt a small hand grab her wrist. Ethan stood in the shadows of the hallway, his blue eyes wide with fear. He pressed a folded paper into her hand, before disappearing back upstairs. In the safety of her car, Grace unfolded the drawing to find a terrifyingly clear message, a crude operating room scene with a small figure on a table, surrounded by monstrous shapes holding knives. At the bottom, in the careful block letters of a child learning to write, "It hurts more now. Please help." Time was running dangerously short. With just 72 hours before the scheduled surgery, Grace needed to act decisively while maintaining enough secrecy to avoid immediate detection. She arrived at work the next morning with her carefully prepared solution concealed in an ordinary cleaning spray bottle, its contents disguised by mint extract that masked any medicinal smell. The household operated in the controlled chaos of preparation for both the upcoming medical procedure and the annual Thompson Foundation Gala, scheduled for the following week, creating opportunities within the distraction. Grace spent the early hours of her shift establishing a visible pattern of routine cleaning, ensuring her presence in various parts of the house would seem unremarkable. Olivia had arranged for Ethan to have his art therapy session in the conservatory that afternoon, creating a window of opportunity when he would be separated from his father, and the ever-present security team Caleb had enhanced since his return. At precisely 2:30, Grace entered the conservatory with cleaning supplies, nodding politely to Miss Chen, the art therapist who had worked with Ethan for years. Their silent alliance had been established through a brief, coded conversation the previous day, with Miss Chen expressing concern about the rushed surgical procedure. In the sunlit room filled with tropical plants, Grace methodically cleaned windows while Miss Chen guided Ethan through painting exercises. When the therapist excused herself to use the restroom as planned, Grace had exactly 4 minutes to implement her solution. Kneeling beside Ethan, who watched her with a mixture of trust and apprehension, Grace signed quickly. "I need to look at your ear. It might feel strange, but should not hurt." She had practiced these reassurances repeatedly, knowing clear communication was essential. Ethan hesitated before tilting his head, wincing as Grace gently inserted the specially prepared dropper into his ear canal. The solution needed 5 minutes to break down the fungal structure before extraction could begin. Grace continued cleaning, maintaining the appearance of normal duties while monitoring Ethan's reactions. When Miss Chen returned, she positioned herself to block any view from the doorway while Grace completed the procedure. Using a small medical spoon tool sanitized with alcohol, Grace carefully extracted the partially dissolved growth, now reduced to a gelatinous mass. What emerged was larger than she had anticipated, a dense colony of fungal material, nearly filling a small specimen jar she had brought for the purpose. As she removed the final fragments, Ethan suddenly gasped, his hands flying up to cover both ears. His eyes widened in shock, darting around the room as his brain processed auditory input for perhaps the first time in his life. The sound of the garden sprinklers, birds outside the windows, even the soft whir of the climate control system assaulted his previously silent world. Grace quickly signed for him to stay calm, explaining that the sounds were normal, that his brain would adjust to processing them. Tears filled the boy's eyes as he heard Grace's voice for the first time, her gentle assurances spoken aloud while she continued signing to provide the communication bridge he needed. The moment of triumph was shattered by the conservatory doors flying open. Caleb Thompson stood frozen in the entrance, having returned unexpectedly from a business lunch. The transformation was immediate, his expression shifting from confusion to comprehension to rage in the span of seconds. "What have you done?" he whispered, the quiet tone more terrifying than any shout. Behind him, Olivia appeared, her face pale with fear at the confrontation she had hoped to prevent. Before Grace could explain, Ethan turned toward his father's voice, an instinctive reaction that confirmed what had happened. The boy spoke his first word, a sound rather than a formed word, but unmistakably a vocal response to auditory stimulus. The security system on Caleb's phone chimed with an alert, drawing his attention momentarily to the screen where security camera footage showed what had just transpired in crystal-clear detail. His expression hardened as he looked back at Grace, every word precisely controlled and vibrating with barely contained fury. "You will regret this for the rest of your life." 5 miles away, in the grand ballroom of the Boston Renaissance Hotel, Caleb's phone dinged again as he stood before 300 of Boston's elite gathered for the Thompson Foundation's annual fundraising gala, his public persona firmly back in place after the afternoon's events. Raising his glass for a toast, he addressed the crowd with practiced charm. "Before we continue our celebration of the Foundation's work with underprivileged youth, I must share a disturbing development. Today, an unqualified member of my household staff took it upon herself to perform an unauthorized and dangerous medical procedure on my son." His voice broke with seemingly genuine emotion. "I've just come from the hospital, where doctors are assessing the damage done by this incompetent experimentation. I promise you, I will spare no expense in bringing this individual to justice and ensuring she never again has the opportunity to endanger a child." The assembled donors murmured in sympathy, unaware that Ethan was not at any hospital but securely held in the Thompson estate under guard, experiencing the overwhelming sensation of sound for the first time while his father publicly vowed to destroy the woman who had made it possible. The full weight of Caleb Thompson's retribution descended upon Grace with breathtaking speed and precision. By sunrise the morning after the procedure, her employment had been terminated. Her apartment building security had been notified she was under investigation for endangering a child, and a preliminary hearing had been scheduled to consider a restraining order, preventing her from coming within 1,000 feet of the Thompson property or family members. The local news carried the story with careful wording that avoided direct accusations while implying criminal negligence, referring to an unidentified domestic employee who had performed unauthorized medical procedures on the son of a prominent businessman. Grace's name wasn't mentioned, but her identity would be easily deducible to anyone familiar with the Thompson household. Caleb's influence extended far beyond his immediate circle. As the largest private employer in the county and a major donor to police benevolent associations and judicial campaign funds, his version of events received immediate credibility from authorities. Grace found herself effectively isolated, her phone filling with cancellations from her part-time elder care clients who had seen the news reports. The small apartment she had maintained through careful budgeting suddenly seemed precarious as her income evaporated overnight. Meanwhile, at the Thompson estate, Ethan remained confined to his rooms, now monitored by a private nurse who reported directly to Caleb. The boy's dramatic change in condition had been explained away as a temporary anomaly, with Caleb insisting to Olivia that actual medical tests showed no real improvement in hearing function. The surgery with Dr. Reynolds would proceed as planned, recast as an emergency intervention to repair damage allegedly caused by Grace's actions. Behind closed doors, however, Caleb was frantically attempting to control a situation that threatened to unravel. Ethan, overwhelmed but adapting quickly to his new sensory input, had begun speaking single words, responding directly to sounds around him in ways that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or wishful thinking. More problematically, he adamantly refused to cooperate with the private nurse or security staff, demanding in his limited vocabulary and expansive sign language to see Grace and his mother. Olivia, emboldened by her son's transformation, had openly challenged Caleb's narrative, insisting on an independent medical evaluation and threatening to take her story to the press if he proceeded with the unnecessary surgery. Caleb's response had been swift and devastating, freezing Olivia's access to all financial accounts and threatening to use her previous struggle with postpartum depression as evidence of mental instability if she sought custody. "Your word against mine," he reminded her coldly. A fragile woman with a history of emotional problems versus a philanthropist who employs hundreds. Choose your next move carefully. The household staff had divided into uneasy factions. Those directly dependent on Caleb's approval maintained the official story that Grace had performed a dangerous, unauthorized procedure. Others, particularly staff of color, who had witnessed similar patterns of discrimination, privately questioned the narrative but kept their doubts hidden to preserve their livelihoods. Harold Jenkins became an essential conduit of information, using his unrestricted grounds access to maintain communication between Grace, Olivia, and sympathetic staff members. On the third morning after her termination, Grace received a call from an unexpected source, Dr. Patricia Williams, head of audiology at Massachusetts General Hospital, and one of the few African-American women in a departmental leadership position, requested an urgent meeting. While maintaining appropriate professional skepticism, Dr. Williams explained that certain elements of the story circulating through medical circles didn't align with established otolaryngological understanding. No fungal extraction, however poorly performed, could suddenly restore hearing in a congenitally deaf child, yet the hospital grapevine buzzed with rumors that the Thompson boy was suddenly responding to auditory stimuli. Grace hesitated before sharing her documentation, knowing the risk of being dismissed as unqualified or delusional. However, the growing threat of criminal charges made professional medical validation essential. At a small cafe far from the hospital, Grace presented her research, photographs, and the sealed specimen jar containing the extracted growth. Dr. Williams examined the material with the measured care of a scientist confronted with anomalous data, neither dismissing nor immediately accepting Grace's explanation. "I'll need to analyze this properly," she said finally. "If what you're describing is accurate, this could represent an undiagnosed condition affecting potentially hundreds of children." The meeting provided Grace a fragile thread of hope, but the immediate situation continued to deteriorate. That afternoon, a preliminary hearing was held regarding the restraining order, with Caleb's attorneys presenting a carefully crafted narrative of an unqualified domestic employee performing dangerous medical procedures based on internet research, potentially causing permanent damage to a vulnerable child. Grace's court-appointed attorney seemed overwhelmed by the opposition's resources and the judge's obvious deference to Caleb Thompson. The ruling came swiftly in Caleb's favor, with the judge citing potential danger to the child and family as justification for the temporary restraining order, pending full investigation. What the court didn't know, and what Grace learned only through Harold's discreet communication, was that other staff members of color had begun organizing in her support. 5 current employees and 7 former household workers, predominantly African American and Hispanic, had documented similar patterns of discrimination, sudden terminations following medical suggestions regarding Ethan, and Caleb's history of using his influence to prevent former employees from finding new positions. Their testimony might not sway the current legal proceedings, but it established a pattern that could prove crucial to Grace's defense. The breaking point came unexpectedly that evening, when an ethics committee meeting was convened at Boston Memorial Hospital to review Dr. Reynolds' proposed surgical procedure. Standard protocol required such review for experimental techniques, particularly those involving minors. What should have been a formality given Reynolds' reputation and Caleb's influence instead became a flashpoint when Dr. Williams requested to present relevant medical information. The committee chairman, Dr. Reynolds' reputation, Jeffrey Harrington, initially refused, citing the pending legal situation. However, several committee members insisted on hearing all pertinent medical facts before approving an invasive procedure on a child. As the debate intensified behind closed doors, sources later revealed that Caleb Thompson had made a substantial donation to Dr. Harrington's research foundation just hours before the meeting. When the committee ultimately voted to proceed with the surgery, despite serious questions about its necessity, 3 members immediately filed formal objections, creating a paper trail that would later prove critical. The Thompson household retired that night in fractured silence, with Ethan still refusing to cooperate with medical staff and Olivia confined to the guest wing. Grace sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by medical research and legal documents, watching her phone for updates from her dwindling circle of allies. The news she received just before midnight changed everything. A nurse who had been monitoring Ethan reported that Caleb had scheduled the surgery for the following morning, bypassing normal protocols under the justification of emergency intervention needed to prevent permanent auditory damage. The battle for Ethan's future had reached its critical moment, with forces arrayed on both sides preparing for a confrontation that would permanently alter all their lives. The Thompson estate security system, a multi-million-dollar network of cameras, motion sensors, and access controls, had been designed to keep intruders out, not to monitor the movements of those already inside. This oversight became critically important, as Ethan Thompson, 8 years old and newly hearing, enacted a plan that showed intelligence and determination far beyond his years. At 3:17 in the morning, he disabled the bedroom monitoring equipment by simply unplugging it during a bathroom break, creating enough time to place pillows under his blankets in the familiar shape of a sleeping child. While the night nurse dozed in the adjacent sitting room, Ethan slipped out through the servants' passage he had mapped during years of silent observation, carrying a backpack containing his tablet computer and the journals where he had documented his experiences. The mansion's West Wing service elevator, rarely used except for transporting cleaning equipment, carried him to the ground floor undetected. Meanwhile, Grace faced her own crisis of conscience, balancing legal jeopardy against Ethan's well-being. The boy's upcoming surgery represented not just an unnecessary medical procedure, but a deliberate attempt to mask the truth about his condition, potentially reimposing the isolation he had endured for years. After hours of anxious deliberation, she made a series of difficult calls, activating a loose coalition of allies including Dr. Williams, Harold Jenkins, and community activists who recognized the case as emblematic of larger patterns of discrimination in healthcare and domestic employment. By dawn, Grace had assembled a small but determined team ready to challenge Caleb Thompson's narrative through legal channels, medical evidence, and, if necessary, public pressure. The missing piece remained documentation of Ethan's current condition, definitive proof that he could now hear, which would invalidate the justification for emergency surgery. That evidence arrived in an unexpected form at 4:38 in the morning, when Grace's doorbell rang. Standing on her apartment threshold was Ethan Thompson, pale and shivering slightly in pajamas covered by a hastily donned coat, clutching his backpack with white-knuckled determination. Grace's shock quickly gave way to urgent concern about the legal implications of his presence. Having a child under a protective order in her apartment, regardless of how he got there, could easily be construed as kidnapping. However, sending him back into the night alone was unthinkable. "I can hear you," Ethan said, his pronunciation imperfect but unmistakable, the first complete sentence he had spoken in her presence. "I recorded Father." The tablet in his backpack contained dozens of audio recordings made over the past 3 days, capturing conversations that thoroughly undermined Caleb's public narrative. Most damning were discussions with Dr. Reynolds about maintaining the appearance of medical necessity while ensuring the surgery would cement Caleb's reputation as a pioneering advocate for innovative treatments. "I want my procedure associated with your name," Caleb had said in one recording. "The Thompson technique has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Within the hour, Olivia Thompson arrived at Grace's apartment, having been alerted by a sympathetic security guard to her son's disappearance. The reunion between mother and son was tearful but brief, overshadowed by the urgent need to prevent the surgery and protect both Ethan and Grace from Caleb's retaliation. Over hurried cups of coffee, they formulated a strategy to present their evidence through proper channels, knowing that direct confrontation would likely backfire given Caleb's connections and influence. By 6:15, Dr. Williams had arrived to conduct a preliminary audiological assessment, documenting Ethan's newfound hearing response with professional equipment and methodology that would stand up to scrutiny. What she found exceeded even Grace's hopes. Not only could Ethan hear, but his auditory pathways showed normal response patterns, indicating that the fungal growth had been blocking rather than damaging his hearing mechanisms. The implications were profound, suggesting that Ethan had never been congenitally deaf as diagnosed, but had developed a rare fungal condition early in infancy that had been consistently misdiagnosed. While this assessment continued, the situation at the Thompson estate descended into controlled chaos. The discovery of Ethan's absence had triggered an immediate security response, with Caleb publicly launching a kidnapping investigation while privately suspecting his wife's involvement. Police officers arrived at Grace's apartment building just after 7:30, responding to an anonymous tip. The confrontation that followed tested the fragile coalition supporting Grace and Ethan. Officers initially demanded immediate custody of the child based on the existing court order, but Dr. R. Pate, Williams's medical credentials and the presence of Olivia as the legal guardian created enough procedural uncertainty to pause immediate action. A tense negotiation ensued, with Olivia requesting an emergency hearing to present new medical evidence before Ethan was returned to his father's custody. The responding officers, trained to prioritize child welfare but aware of the political sensitivities involved with the Thompson family, reluctantly agreed to escort all parties to the courthouse for an emergency determination rather than forcibly removing Ethan. The courthouse steps became the backdrop for the day's most dramatic moment. As the small group approached the entrance, they encountered Caleb Thompson and his legal team arriving from the opposite direction. Seeing his son walking between Grace and Olivia, Caleb advanced menacingly, his carefully maintained public persona cracking under pressure. "Give me my son," he demanded, reaching for Ethan's arm. What happened next was captured by multiple witnesses and several news cameras that had gathered in response to police scanner chatter about the Thompson case. Ethan, hearing his father's voice clearly for the first time in his life, stepped back and spoke loudly enough for everyone present to hear. "No, you wanted me broken. She fixed me." The clear speech from a child previously known to be deaf created an immediate sensation among the gathered crowd. Caleb, momentarily stunned, recovered quickly with practiced charm. "Ethan, buddy, your condition is making you confused. These people have manipulated you. Let's get you to the hospital where Dr. Reynolds is waiting." Grace stepped forward, maintaining careful distance but speaking firmly. "The growth I removed from his ear has been analyzed by specialists. He never needed surgery. He wasn't born deaf. He had a fungal blockage that was repeatedly missed." Caleb's expression darkened as he turned to the nearest officer. "Arrest this woman. She kidnapped my son and performed an illegal medical procedure. She's been served with a restraining order and is in direct violation." Before the officer could respond, Dr. Williams intervened, presenting her medical credentials and preliminary findings. "As a matter of public health and medical ethics, I've documented a condition that may affect other misdiagnosed children. This requires proper investigation before any irreversible procedures are performed." The standoff continued for several tense minutes until Judge Marion Coleman, known for her no-nonsense approach to family court matters, dispatched a clerk to bring all parties into her chambers immediately, bypassing normal scheduling procedures in light of the potential medical urgency involving a child. What followed was a closed-door session that would later be described by court observers as one of the most remarkable pretrial hearings in recent memory, with Caleb Thompson's carefully constructed narrative colliding with medical evidence and first-hand testimony that couldn't be easily dismissed or buried. By mid-afternoon, 3 significant developments had occurred. Temporary custody of Ethan had been awarded to Olivia pending full hearings. The restraining order against Grace had been temporarily suspended to allow for complete medical documentation of Ethan's condition, and perhaps most significantly, Judge Coleman had ordered all evidence preserved for review by an independent medical board, effectively halting any surgical intervention until a complete investigation could be conducted. As Grace left the courthouse, physically exhausted but resolute, she found a small group of women waiting on the steps, former employees of the Thompson household who had come forward to support her case despite risks to their own reputations and employment prospects. Their silent presence, a visible representation of solidarity against systemic injustice, provided the first moment of hope that the truth might actually prevail against wealth and influence. That evening, as news of the courthouse confrontation spread through carefully worded reports that avoided direct accusations while noting the unusual circumstances, Grace received a text message from an unknown number. "Thank you for fighting for my son when I couldn't find the courage. We have a long battle ahead, but he's talking, Grace. My boy is talking because of you. No matter what happens with Caleb, that miracle belongs to us, and no one can take it away." 38 days after the courthouse confrontation, Grace sat in the small conference room of Bennett, Washington & Lee, the civil rights law firm that had taken her case pro bono after recognizing its potential impact on medical discrimination cases nationwide. Across the polished table, attorneys James Washington and Kimberly Lee reviewed documents for the upcoming depositions, occasionally consulting Grace on specific details. The case had evolved far beyond a personal dispute between a domestic employee and a wealthy employer, expanding into interconnected investigations of medical malpractice, employment discrimination, and potential insurance fraud related to Ethan's years of unnecessary treatments. "We've received the complete analysis of the fungal specimen," Washington said, sliding a folder across the table. "Dr. Parrott, Williams and the mycology team at Johns Hopkins have confirmed it's a previously undocumented variant of Aspergillus tubangensis, with unusual growth patterns that specifically target the auditory canal. They're calling it the Marshall variant, in recognition of your discovery." Grace absorbed this information with the calm demeanor she had cultivated through weeks of legal proceedings, though the naming acknowledgement touched her deeply. More important was the confirmation that similar fungal infections had now been identified in 11 other children previously diagnosed with congenital deafness, validating her original observations and potentially changing lives beyond Ethan's. During these weeks of legal maneuvering, Ethan had flourished under his mother's care in a new apartment secured through the court's temporary support order. His hearing continued to improve, and speech therapy sessions were helping him develop verbal communication skills with remarkable speed. Olivia had enrolled him in a progressive educational program that balanced his existing sign language skills with new auditory learning, creating a supportive environment for his transition. The most significant development, however, lay in the documents. Grace was reviewing today records obtained through discovery that revealed Caleb Thompson had previously buried research into similar fungal conditions conducted by Thompson Medical Subsidiaries, a pharmaceutical research division of his corporation. The research had identified potential fungal causes of auditory blockage 5 years earlier, but pursuing this line of investigation would have undermined the more profitable development of surgical implants and long-term therapeutic programs already in the company's pipeline. The documents provided the first concrete evidence that Ethan's condition may have been deliberately left untreated to serve corporate financial interests, a revelation that had transformed the legal landscape of the case. Caleb Thompson's position had deteriorated rapidly following the initial court appearance. His attempts to portray Grace as an unqualified domestic worker endangering his son had collapsed under the weight of medical evidence and Ethan's obvious improvement. More damaging were the emerging patterns of discriminatory practices throughout his business operations, revealed through testimony from former employees and internal documents obtained through increasingly broad discovery orders. What had begun as a personal vendetta against Grace had expanded into investigations of hiring practices, promotion patterns, and wage disparities across Thompson Enterprises, with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission now conducting a formal review. Caleb had retreated from public view, canceling speaking engagements and charitable appearances, while his legal and public relations teams attempted to contain the spreading damage. His last public statement, issued through corporate channels, had characterized the situation as a misunderstanding fueled by a disgruntled former employee, language carefully calibrated to avoid potential defamation while maintaining his position as the wronged party. Privately, he had attempted various strategies to regain control, including offering Grace a substantial settlement with stringent confidentiality requirements, which she had immediately declined on advice of counsel. The litigation strategy had shifted in response to mounting evidence. What began as a defensive posture for Grace had transformed into multiple affirmative claims, with her legal team now pursuing damages for wrongful termination, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and other claims that collectively sought not just compensation, but structural reforms within Thompson Enterprises. The upcoming deposition of Dr. Alexander Reynolds promised to be particularly revealing. As preliminary questioning had indicated, he might be willing to acknowledge that the proposed surgery had been scheduled without complete medical justification, potentially to curry favor with a wealthy patron rather than serve the patient's best interests. The legal proceedings, though promising, represented only one dimension of the ongoing struggle. Grace had faced personal and professional challenges that tested her resolve daily. Despite validation from medical professionals and growing public support, she had encountered difficulty securing new employment, with potential employers wary of becoming entangled in the high-profile dispute. Her apartment building had declined to renew her lease, citing tenant complaints about media presence, though no reporters had ever approached the property. More troubling were the anonymous threats received through social media and email, messages that never explicitly mentioned Caleb Thompson, but carried veiled warnings about challenging powerful men and knowing her place. Throughout these trials, an unexpected community had formed around Grace. Former employees of the Thompson household, predominantly people of color who had experienced similar discrimination, provided practical support and testimony that strengthened her case. Medical professionals, impressed by her observational skills and persistence, had created a scholarship fund to allow her to complete the nursing degree she had abandoned due to financial constraints years earlier. Most surprisingly, a support group for parents of children with similar fungal infections had formed almost overnight after the initial medical findings were published, with families seeking Grace's insights while navigating their own diagnostic journeys. On this particular afternoon, as Grace reviewed documents in preparation for her own deposition, her phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. Attached was a video of Ethan reading aloud from a children's book, his pronunciation still developing but his joy unmistakable. "He asked me to send this to you," Olivia had written. "He reads this book every night and wanted you to hear how good he's getting." The simple moment of connection provided renewed purpose amid the legal complexities. What had begun as an isolated act of compassion had expanded into a movement with the potential to change medical understanding and corporate accountability. As Grace prepared to leave the law office, her attorney mentioned one final development for the day. The federal investigation into Thompson Medical subsidiaries has expanded to include potential securities violations related to undisclosed research that might have affected stock valuations. The SEC has requested all documents related to the fungal studies. The regulatory landscape is shifting quickly. Grace absorbed this information with the same measured calm she had maintained throughout the process, recognizing that justice often arrived through unexpected channels. The battle was far from over. Caleb Thompson retained significant resources and influence that would make final resolution difficult and potentially distant. Yet, for the first time since the confrontation began, Grace allowed herself to envision not just personal vindication, but systemic change that might protect others from similar experiences. Tomorrow's depositions would bring new challenges, but tonight she would call her brother Malcolm, now a healthy adult thanks to their mother's similar persistence against medical dismissal years ago, and share the video of Ethan reading. Some victories needed to be celebrated even as the larger war continued. The grand boardroom of Thompson Enterprises occupied the entire top floor of the downtown headquarters, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Boston Harbor. For decades, this room had hosted confidential discussions that shaped industries and influenced regional politics, its mahogany table witnessing countless negotiations where Caleb Thompson held every advantage. Today, however, the room served a different purpose, transformed into a quasi-courtroom for the most consequential confrontation in the company's history. The court-ordered mediation brought together all parties in the expanding litigation, a last attempt at resolution before proceeding to public trial. Grace entered alongside her legal team, now expanded to include specialists in corporate governance and federal regulatory compliance. Across the room sat Caleb Thompson, flanked by attorneys from 3 separate firms, his appearance noticeably altered after months of legal battling. The commanding presence that once dominated rooms had diminished, his face drawn with stress and calculation as he evaluated the changing power dynamics. Beside him, conspicuously separated by an empty chair, Dr. Alexander Reynolds projected professional detachment, though his frequent glances toward his legal counsel betrayed underlying anxiety. Mediator Judge Sandra Washington, a retired federal judge with unimpeachable credentials, called the proceedings to order with a pointed reminder that her recommendations would carry significant weight with the court if the case proceeded to trial. The structured discussions began with presentations of core evidence, most damaging being the recently uncovered internal communications revealing that Thompson medical subsidiaries had identified the specific fungal pathogen affecting Ethan and potentially thousands of other children 5 years earlier. Researchers had developed a simple diagnostic test and effective treatment protocol, only to have the entire project buried when financial projections showed it would undermine more profitable long-term treatment options already in development. The meeting's dynamic shifted dramatically with the arrival of Olivia and Ethan Thompson, their entrance carefully timed to coincide with discussion of the human impact of the case. At 10 years old, Ethan had transformed from the silent, withdrawn child of months earlier into an articulate, engaged boy eager to share his experience. Judge Washington had specifically requested his participation, overruling objections from Caleb's attorneys, with a reminder that the child's welfare remained central to all related proceedings. When Ethan spoke, the room fell into respectful silence. "My whole life, they told me I couldn't hear because I was born broken," he said, his speech clear, despite some pronunciation challenges. "But I wasn't broken. There was something in my ear that nobody wanted to find, because the grown-ups had already decided what was wrong with me." His direct gaze at his father carried years of accumulated frustration. Grace was the only one who really looked at me instead of looking at charts and machines. The testimony continued with remarkable composure, as Ethan described his experience since regaining his hearing, from the joy of hearing music to the challenges of processing auditory input after years of silence. He shared recordings he had made documenting his father's private statements about the financial and reputational benefits of the proposed surgery, evidence that had proven central to the expanding investigations. The clinical corporate atmosphere of the boardroom had no defense against the authentic voice of a child describing years of unnecessary isolation. As the mediation progressed into its second day, focus shifted to the structural reforms that would form part of any potential settlement. Grace's legal team, bolstered by intervention from public health advocates and disability rights organizations, proposed comprehensive changes to Thompson Enterprises' healthcare subsidiaries, including independent oversight of research priorities, revised compensation structures that didn't incentivize prolonged treatments, and mandatory second opinions for all pediatric cases involving sensory function. More controversial was the demand for establishment of an independent foundation to identify and treat children with similar fungal infections, funded by Thompson Enterprises, but governed by an independent board that would include Grace and medical professionals with relevant expertise. Caleb's resistance weakened visibly as federal investigators presented evidence suggesting knowledge of the fungal research had extended to senior executives who had made strategic stock transactions shortly after the findings were buried, potentially constituting securities violations that could trigger criminal charges beyond the civil litigation. The turning point came unexpectedly during a procedural discussion about document production. Dr. Turning. Reynolds, increasingly isolated as evidence mounted of his willingness to perform medically unnecessary procedures for wealthy clients, made a unilateral decision that shocked both sides of the dispute. "I wish to provide a complete statement regarding my involvement in this matter," he announced, ignoring the frantic signals from his attorney. The proposed surgical procedure was never medically indicated for the Thompson child. I was aware of alternative diagnostic possibilities, but proceeded due to financial incentives and professional opportunities associated with the Thompson name. The room erupted into controlled chaos. with Caleb's attorneys immediately calling for recess, while Judge Washington maintained order with practiced authority. When proceedings resumed an hour later, the power balance had shifted permanently. Reynolds had provided a sworn statement detailing how Caleb had personally offered naming rights for the surgical technique and guaranteed referrals from wealthy clients in exchange for prioritizing the procedure and publicly supporting the narrative that Grace had endangered the child. The doctor's decision to break ranks, motivated by increasing scrutiny of his other cases and the possibility of medical license revocation, removed the last significant support for Caleb's version of events. By late afternoon, settlement discussions had begun in earnest, with Caleb's representatives now focused on damage control rather than vindication. The proposed terms included full retraction of all accusations against Grace, substantial financial compensation for defamation and wrongful termination, establishment of the Independent Medical Foundation, and implementation of all proposed reforms to Thompson healthcare divisions. In exchange, Grace would withdraw claims that might trigger criminal liability, allowing Caleb to preserve some portion of his business empire and personal freedom, if not his reputation. As the room cleared for the day, Grace found herself momentarily alone with Caleb in the anteroom, an uncomfortable proximity after months of conflict through legal intermediaries. His attempt at intimidating stare failed to mask the desperate calculation behind his eyes. "This will destroy everything I've built," he said, voice tight with controlled fury. "You had no right to interfere with my son." Grace met his gaze steadily. No longer the invisible domestic worker trained to look away in his presence. "Your son has a name," she responded quietly. "Ethan has a voice now, in every sense. That's what this was always about." The final moments of confrontation were interrupted by the return of legal teams, but the fundamental truth had been spoken. What had begun as a power imbalance between employer and employee, between wealth and service, had evolved into a reckoning that extended far beyond individual personalities to address systemic failures that had silenced vulnerable voices. As Grace left the Thompson Enterprises Tower that evening, the setting sun cast her shadow long across the plaza. The legal battle would continue for months before final resolution, but the fundamental victory had already been secured, Ethan could hear. The truth had emerged, and accountability now seemed not just possible but inevitable. The next morning's headline in the Boston Globe would capture the essence of the transformation "Silenced Voices Speak: How a Domestic Worker's Observation Changed Pediatric Medicine." The article would mark the beginning of public recognition, but for Grace, validation had come much earlier, in the simple sound of a child's voice speaking her name with gratitude. Spring sunshine filtered through the windows of the newly established Marshall Center for Auditory Diagnostics, bringing warmth to the playfully designed reception area where children of various ages engaged with interactive displays designed to identify subtle hearing abnormalities. 6 months had passed since the settlement agreement that transformed the landscape of pediatric audiology while reshaping corporate accountability standards across the healthcare industry. The center, located in a repurposed wing of Boston Medical Center and funded through the settlement's mandated foundation, had already screened over 300 children and identified 27 cases of fungal auditory obstruction, similar to Ethan's condition. Each successful treatment represented a life fundamentally changed, a child liberated from silence, not through expensive surgical intervention, but through accurate diagnosis and appropriate care. Grace Marshall, dressed in the white coat that signified her role as patient advocacy director, reviewed intake files for the day's appointments, while occasionally glancing at the framed Boston Globe article on the wall, its headline now a mission statement for the center's work, "Silenced Voices Speak." The settlement terms, finalized after 2 more months of negotiation, had exceeded even her attorney's ambitious projections. Beyond substantial financial compensation that secured Grace's future and funded her return to education, the agreement mandated structural reforms throughout Thompson Enterprises' healthcare divisions, established independent oversight of research priorities, and created the foundation that now supported the Marshall Center's operations nationwide. More significant than the financial and organizational provisions had been the public accountability measures. Caleb Thompson had been required to issue a comprehensive retraction of all accusations against Grace, acknowledge the validity of her observations regarding Ethan's condition, and step down as CEO of Thompson Enterprises while remaining the principal shareholder. The company now operated under new leadership, committed to implementing the settlement's reform provisions under court supervision. The settlement had explicitly avoided triggering criminal charges, allowing Caleb to preserve personal freedom and portions of his wealth in exchange for meaningful systemic change. The morning's most significant appointment arrived precisely at 9:30. Ethan Thompson, now 11 years old, bounded into the center with the energy characteristic of his age, followed more sedately by his mother Olivia, who had traded designer clothing for the practical attire of a foundation board member actively engaged in its operations. Ethan's quarterly checkup represented both medical monitoring and symbolic continuity, a reminder of the case that had launched the center's mission. "Hey, Miss Marshall," he called, his speech now fluent after months of intensive therapy. "I got the lead in the school play. Can you believe it? I have the most lines of anyone." His excitement echoed through the reception area, drawing smiles from staff who recognized the profound significance of a formerly deaf child embracing verbal performance. Olivia offered a warm hug to Grace, their relationship having evolved from the awkward employer-employee dynamic to genuine collaboration built on shared purpose. "The foundation board meeting is at 11, she reminded Grace. "We're reviewing the expansion proposals for the Chicago and Atlanta centers." Grace nodded, mentally shifting between her various responsibilities. The settlement had created not just compensation but purpose, allowing her to complete her nursing degree while simultaneously developing the patient advocacy program that now served as a model for medical institutions nationwide. Her experience had transformed from individual vindication to systemic reform, with the fungal variant bearing her name now included in standard pediatric screening protocols across the country. The legal aftermath continued to reverberate beyond the immediate case. Thompson Enterprises had undergone comprehensive restructuring, with new leadership implementing reformed research protocols that prioritized patient outcomes over treatment longevity. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's investigation had resulted in a separate consent decree addressing hiring practices and workplace culture throughout the corporation. Dr.com. Reynolds had surrendered his medical license rather than face disciplinary proceedings, though several of his former patients had initiated separate litigation regarding potentially unnecessary procedures. Most significantly, the case had sparked a national conversation about medical discrimination, with particular focus on how race, class, and power dynamics affected diagnostic accuracy and treatment recommendations. Grace's testimony before congressional committees had helped shape proposed legislation establishing stronger protections for healthcare workers who identified potential misdiagnosis or inappropriate treatment plans. While legislation moved at its characteristic pace, the cultural impact had been immediate, with medical schools incorporating the Thompson case into ethics curriculum and hospital systems, implementing anonymous reporting systems for staff observations. Caleb Thompson himself had largely disappeared from public view, reportedly dividing his time between a reduced corporate role and a newly purchased property in Switzerland. His absence from Boston's social and philanthropic circles marked the end of an era of unquestioned influence, though the corporation bearing his name continued under reformed leadership. Olivia had finalized divorce proceedings and established herself as an advocate for pediatric healthcare reform, channeling portions of her settlement into supporting similar cases nationwide. For Grace, perhaps the most meaningful outcome lay not in institutional change, but in individual transformation. Ethan's quarterly visits provided tangible evidence of the impact a single observation, pursued with determination against overwhelming opposition, could have on a human life. The boy who had once communicated solely through art and gesture now chattered enthusiastically about school performances, new friends, and his growing interest in marine biology, sparked by finally being able to hear whale songs during a class field trip. What began with removing a fungal growth had expanded into removing barriers of all kinds, creating space for his authentic voice to emerge. The Marshall Center's waiting room gradually filled with the morning's appointments, each family bringing unique stories that reflected variations of the same fundamental hope. Parents who had been told their children's conditions were permanent now arrived with cautious optimism, having read about Ethan's case and wondering if similar possibilities existed for their children. Not every case would match his dramatic outcome, but each received the thorough, compassionate evaluation that Grace had instituted as the center's standard, ensuring that no observation would be dismissed due to the observer's status or background. As Grace prepared to meet with the first patient of the day, her phone chimed with a message from her brother Malcolm. "Just saw the feature about your center on the morning news. Mom would have been so proud. Remember how she fought for me when nobody would listen." The simple acknowledgement connected present to past, placing Grace's individual experience within a longer tradition of persistence against medical dismissal, a lineage of advocates who recognized that healing often began with truly seeing the person before attempting to treat the condition. The day stretched ahead with appointments, meetings, and administrative responsibilities, but Grace moved through them with the centered purpose of someone who had found her calling through adversity. The sound of children's voices, the same voices that might have remained silent without intervention, filled the center with constant reminders of why the struggle had been necessary and worthwhile. In quiet moments between appointments, Grace sometimes reflected on the improbable journey from household maid to healthcare advocate, from invisibility to influence. The transformation had not come without cost. The months of legal battles, financial precarity, and personal attacks had taken their toll. Yet the outcome had created ripples extending far beyond her individual circumstances to touch lives she would never personally encounter, creating systemic changes that would outlast any single career or institution. Have you ever noticed how something that seems impossible suddenly becomes possible when someone simply refuses to accept the status quo? The question emerged naturally at community forums and educational presentations where Grace now regularly spoke. Your voice matters, especially when speaking for those who cannot yet speak for themselves. When we truly listen to silenced voices, we often discover they have the most important things to say. If today's story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone finding their voice after being silenced? How did it change them and those around them? Your experiences and insights help build our community of support. If this journey touched your heart, please like this video so others can discover it too. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that illuminate paths to justice and healing. And share with anyone who needs to be reminded that seemingly impossible transformations become possible when we refuse to accept limitations imposed by others. Thank you for joining me today. May we all have the courage to listen for silenced voices and the wisdom to help them speak their truth.